And why would that be important? Because the very structure of the whole Pentateuch is Messianic. So if the whole structure of the whole Pentateuch is Messianic, it would be very important genealogically to know that no, the seed is not the son of Pharaoh. The seed is not the son of all these other people. It's not from Hagar. It's specifically according to the promise of God. So the people reading Genesis for the first time, they would see this. I mean, maybe we don't see it because we have other interests in our head.
Sure.
But those are questions that would be germane to them. Like, wait a minute, I heard a story about Abraham going down to Egypt. Mm-hmm. How do we know that the child is not Pharaoh's son?
Right.
Well, you will read the narrative and say, oh, okay, now that we have the benefit of the whole Pentateuch in one book, mm-hmm. okay, we can actually see how it plays out over time.
Welcome back to Advent Next, a theological podcast curated for curious faith discussions. This week, our guest is once again Dr. Jerome Skinner, professor of Old Testament exegesis and theology at Andrews University. If you haven't already checked out last week's episode with him on how to read the Bible, be sure to do so. There are lots of insights into the kind of approaches and methods that will help you when studying Scripture. This week, we are applying our knowledge from last week to the book of Genesis. We discuss topics like, is the book of Genesis a scientific account of creation? How early in the Torah are we introduced to the concept of the Messiah? And how central is this to the theme of the Old Testament? Before we get started, we want to thank the Adventist Learning Community for making this program possible. If you're not already following us on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube, be sure to find us at the handle @AdventNext. My co-host today is Michelle Odinma. You can find her at the handle @MichelleOdinmaMusic. And our guest today, Dr. Jerome Skinner, can be found at the handle @Skins2K2. I'm your host, Kendra Arsenal, and this is Advent Next. Genesis has been a really fun book to study in your class. Right now I'm taking a family through the book of Genesis. It's so impactful, kind of the framework that you were giving. So applying some of that methodological approaches that you were talking about, like in comparison to other ancient Near Eastern literature, how is like the accounts of creation and different accounts like a polemic against kind of different ancient Near Eastern culture and literature?
Sure. First, polemic means like an argument against. And this is why I'd say you do need to do a little detective work, because the way that we're arguing about the creation narrative today has little to nothing to do with why it was originally written. People are trying to squeeze, science into Genesis. And I say, was that what Moses was thinking?
Sure.
So when he wrote Genesis, probably near the time of the Exodus, okay? So when he's writing with a specific intent, okay? They're coming out of a land of polytheism, and they're going into a land of polytheism.
Right.
So how would you tell people about what it means to be in the image of God where they don't confuse that with these polytheistic nations? Because every nation had a creation narrative. That's the first thing that I know is very different than our world today. Mm-hmm. Everyone had some type of creation narrative. So Moses is saying, okay, how am I going to tell the people what it means to be a child of God without them confusing it with something that may look similar? Because some of the ancient Near Eastern narratives do have creation out of the spoken word. So how do we not confuse the two? So actually the way that Moses writes the story, it's not a detailed analysis of what happened on each day, okay? But the narrative is told in such a way where you would understand that he's saying this is not a God. I'll give you an example. On day 4, in verse 14, it says in Genesis chapter 1, it says, "And God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. And let them be for lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light upon the earth. And it was so. And God made 2 great lights." Now, if he had named the Hebrew word for sun, Shemesh, remember they didn't, well, maybe you don't remember, but they didn't have vowels.
I remember.
So, okay.
That I do.
So Shemesh looks like Shamash, who is the god of judgment in the ancient Near East. And the word Uriach in the ancient Near East, for Hebrews, it would mean moon, but in their context, it's a deity. So he doesn't say sun and moon, he just says two great lights and stars also. Okay? So that's one point. He's trying to help these people not fall into paganism. So he's explaining things in a way for them not to confuse where they're coming from or where they're going with a deity. Okay, so when he names the sea, again, ancient Near Easterners saw the sea as Yam, the sea, the dread god. So how do you let the people of Israel know, no, it's just water? So he just talks about, he just created the sea and out of them came these animals. So you just see it as something non-aggressive, something that God just spoke and it just happened. So we don't have to be afraid of it. Okay, but the one that I wanted to focus on the most is man and woman. So I want us to read Genesis 1:27.
Okay.
It says, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Now, for us English speakers, it just seems like, male and female. This is actually not the word for male and female. Okay, it's the word zakar and the word nekava. Okay, so the word zakar is used typically for memorial stone. So it's something that protrudes. And the word nekava comes from the root nakav, which means to pierce. So you can use your thinking caps, sanctified thinking caps, something that protrudes and something that is pierced. Now, why would God talk about men and women that way? Turn to Deuteronomy Chapter 4 and verse 16, and I think this explains why. He says in Deuteronomy 4, verse 16, beware lest you act corruptly by making a carved image for yourself in the form of any figure, the likeness of male or female. And it's those two words again. So again, the creation narrative is you're made in the image of God, and he gave you a physiology, an anatomy and a physiology. Don't go worship that.
Yeah.
Okay? So it is polemical. This is how creation really happened. More importantly, this is how you're to relate to what it means to be human in the world that God created. So you don't go worship the things that God just created.
Sure.
Yeah.
So what it means to be in God's image is deeper than we tend to give credit for when it comes to understanding the narrative in the Torah. You know, for us, we're not thinking idol worship,
Yeah.
We're just thinking, what did he do with this element and this element? How did that fit together?
Right.
No, for them it was, don't worship phallic symbols. Don't even make them to worship them. Why? Right. Because you were made in God's image and he already gave you that for a specific function.
Sure. So along the lines of being human and what that means, you've talked about 6 different aspects of what we find in Genesis. Can you expound on that a little bit more?
Sure. So again, this close reading experience, I started to see the Bible does give us hints at what it means to be human. It's not like Kierkegaard or Jean-Paul Sartre trying to go into the psychological depths of existentialism.
Sure.
But it does tell us what it means to be in the image of God is more holistic than we tend to give credit for. So the 6 things were moral, we're social, we're intellectual, we're emotive, we're physical, and we're spiritual. So I'll just go point by point. Yeah. So first, we're moral because God gives Adam and Eve commands. And you would only give someone a command if they have the moral or the ethical foundation to understand it and apply it.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah.
We're social because God told them to be fruitful and multiply. And then he said, it's not good for you to be alone. So we usually read that just in the context of marriage, but it's more in depth than that. It's just you're a social being, so it's not good for you to be alone. They're intellectual. We see God bring the animals to Adam to see what he would name them. He didn't tell him, name it this.
Right.
No, he says, what would you name that? And then Adam would look and say, oh, well, that looks like this. Okay? We're emotive beings, and I always point this out to my wife. When Adam saw Eve, he did not burst forth in didactic logic. He saw her, and the brother broke forth in poetry.
Right.
Okay.
That's right.
And it's beautiful poetry if you can read it in the original language. So I know as modern day people, we don't tend to associate, emotions with God. You need to be austere and strict, or you have people who go to the other extreme. But God gave Adam that capacity, and then he gave Eve the capacity too. So we know we have that capacity. And we know they're physical beings, because the only way to be fruitful and multiply is to be physical. And by the way, I want to just touch on that. I think because we haven't read the text in this way as a more holistic picture of what it means to be human, the church historically has had a problem with sexuality.
Sure.
And so if young people don't learn it from the church, where else are they going to learn it from?
Yeah,
right.
So that was, when I came back to the Lord, that was the first thing I had to deal with, because I wasn't always a Christian,
Sure.
And so I had a certain mentality, and God had to really fix that. And so I had to go to these narratives and say, okay, how should I see sexuality as a blessing rather than something you have to go do in secret or away from people? So when I saw that this is actually part of the way that God made us, it gave me existential peace. I'm like, okay, it's not something dirty. It's not something we need to be ashamed of, but God tells us what it should look like. And so if we can tell our young people, look, God made you a holistic being, and sin can manifest itself in different ways based on, nature, nurture, what have you. I think it would give young people more of a clear understanding that, hey, this is not something I need to keep secret and hide away. It's something actually I can talk to God about.
Right.
And then finally, he made them spiritual beings. We know he gave them the Sabbath for rest. So when I started seeing this, I said, okay, so that's what he gave to them. What did it look like? And then we see it experienced in Adam and Eve's life. It's very brief, but there's enough there to really tell you, how are they moral? How are they social? How are they intellectual? How are they emotive? How are they physical? How are they spiritual? And if you notice, right after sin, we start to see all these elements come into full play. And so really, from Genesis 3 to Revelation 19, we see God trying to restore in humanity his image. And if God is trying to restore in humanity his image, all of these areas of life need to be addressed.
Sure.
You cannot just address the brain.
Right.
Because if you do that, you can become really cold and isolated. Because it has to be rational, it has to make sense. Well, what about the emotive side of life? Even affects the way that we read the Bible. Excuse me, going back to methodology. If you know God created us to be emotive, you understand why 40% of the Old Testament is in poetry.
I love that. It's so beautiful.
Me too.
Yeah.
So when I started to start making these connections, I said, wow. So each narrative, I'm trying to figure out, okay, what's the problem with humanity here? Okay, so now I'm not looking at it necessarily to try to solve my existential problems first and foremost. That comes, but it comes later. But just, okay, God, show me in this instance of human brokenness, what area do we see being affected? And then if you do deal with it, how do you deal with it? So learning this for me was helpful, because I started to see that religion is not just information. Sure. Okay, it's not just behaviorism, but it's God really addressing the totality of what it means to be human. Wow. And Kierkegaard, he was a Christian, but existentialists don't have like a corner market on what it means to be human. Like whenever you use words like that, people are like, you're an existentialist. I'm like, no, I'm a biblical, disciple of Jesus. And I try to show people it's not just a story about a fall, but it's a fall from a certain type of life and the restoration to that life again.
Wow. I love that.
Just a comment, I guess it kind of makes me understand more the impact that sin had on our whole being. So all of those 6 aspects were affected. So I mean, every part of us needs to be restored.
Right.
Yeah. So. Amen. So there's one thing that you talk about that I appreciated, helping me to give the framework of like what's happening in Genesis. And you talked about that there is a promise, there are threats to the promise, and then there is God's salvation, bringing about an ultimate deliverance. And I was wondering if you could walk us through some of those examples and what that looks like in Genesis, and why was it framed in this type of way?
Sure. If you have a computer program, talking to the audience, if you can take the chapter and verse divisions off your iPad or your Samsung, I don't know if people I'm not getting a financial kickback from talking about Apple. No. But if you can do that and then ask yourself a question, if I didn't know where a section started and stopped, how would I know how the narrative is moving? So I did that. Okay. I'm one of those nerds, and I said, let me see. And actually, I still try to do that today because it didn't have chapters and verses. So I was reading through multiple times, by the way. It's not like you're going to do this one time and poof. Yeah. No. So I started to say, okay, what happened in the beginning? We see mankind created, mankind have a fall, and then God gives a promise, okay? Once I saw that, I said, okay, so everything that's following now has to in some way deal with this promise that God gave in Genesis 3:15. So first he gives it to Adam and Eve. He tells them a seed is going to come. And the first thing that we hear in Genesis 4 is what?
Cain.
Right.
Yeah.
She says, I have gotten a man.
From the Lord, yeah.
But that's the thing. We think it's from the Lord. There is no preposition. And I'm a nerd, so again, I was looking at the grammatical syntax. Moses actually uses that for people who want to go check me. Check if I'm saying is true. In Genesis 26:34, when it talks about Judith, that same grammatical structure, and they don't say from Judith.
Okay? I see,
they just say the wife, Judith. So she probably thought, and I think she thought she was having the Messiah, because that's the last thing that they heard from God. You're going to have a son.
So it says, I've gotten a man, the Lord.
Right. Dr. Ducan's commentary on Genesis actually explores that more. So if people wanted to have a good reading of that passage. So she thinks she has a son, or she thinks she has this figure that is promised. What happens?
He becomes a murderer.
He's a murderer. So wait a minute. We thought that the seed is going to come and redeem. Why is, my son murdering my other son? So then there's a threat now. One son is a murderer, one son is dead. How does God rectify that? At the end of chapter 4, who do you have? Seth. Okay. So things are back on track. Seth, that's when people begin to call on the name of the Lord. Then you have a problem. What happens in chapter 5 and chapter 6?
It's the flood, right?
The wickedness.
Right. You have the covenant or the faithful line in 5. Sounds good. But then in 6, we hear every imagination of everybody is evil, to the fact that God's going to destroy the whole earth.
Sure. Yeah.
So then it's like, wait a minute. How is God's promise going to come to fruition if we're all destroyed?
Right.
And it's interesting that in Genesis 6:17 or 18, it says, and Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Okay. And then he tells him specifically, I will reestablish, that's another grammatical point, I will reestablish my covenant with you. And then soon as the flood narrative ends, what do we hear about? His sons. Okay? So we're hearing about, in the tense of
Shem.
Japheth. Right. So we're back on track. Then what happens next?
Ham messes up. And
the Tower of Babel.
Oh, yeah.
So now we had the family together, but now nobody can understand each other. How is God going to deal with that? Genesis 12 with Abraham. What does he tell Abraham now? You're going to be a blessing to who?
Everybody.
All the nations. Okay, but now he specifically tells him, in your seed. Okay, so now we know it's specifically going to be through Abraham's seed. So now, to make a long story short, think of it, every conflict in the book of Genesis. It's like things are getting on track and then something happens. For instance, Genesis 13, Lot Genesis 14, the war with the king Chedorlaomer. So you have these conflicts. How does God solve it? Abraham wins and Lot goes to Sodom. And then at the end of that experience, what does Abraham do? Who does he meet?
A Melchizedek.
Melchizedek. I have a funny story.
Okay. I love the stories.
I was with my mentor, and we were cutting down trees across the street from the church that we were at. And there was this inebriated gentleman, that's what we'll say. And we were talking, and he said, I had a question. And we were like, okay, go ahead. And now I'm just, getting my chops, learning the ropes. And he said, I want to talk to you about Chief Macadite. We said, what? He said, Chief Macadite. And we were like, what are you talking about? He said, the guy in Hebrews, Chief Macadite. And I said, Melchizedek. And he said, yeah, Chief Macadite. And I said,
oh my goodness.
I said, hey, at least he knows where to find him. So there was some redeeming quality. But that story about Melchizedek introduces important themes in terms of the promise to Abraham. And that's why Jesus is used, or Melchizedek is used as a type of Jesus later on in Hebrews. Okay? So then things seem good, but then what happens next? Hagar.
Right.
Okay, Sarah is barren. She's trying to negotiate, how can we get the seed in the family? We'll do it through Hagar.
Yeah.
And then God has to come in the next chapter and say, no, not through her, through your very loins.
Yeah.
And I always find it interesting, and I mentioned this in class, how people always mention that Sarah laughed. But if you read the previous chapter, it says Abraham laughed too. So it's just a little interesting point about what we emphasize when we tend to read the Bible.
Yeah.
So then you have this conflict, is a seed going to be born? Even the narratives when they go to Egypt. Think about it. What would the people during that time be concerned about? Is the seed the son of Pharaoh or Abraham? Is the seed the son of the king of Gerar or Abraham?
Right.
When Rebekah is taken, is the seed of Isaac from Isaac or from the king of Gerar?
Interesting.
So when the narrative is being told, Moses is trying to help us see, no, the promised seed comes through the way God said it was going to happen. And every time something popped up that would threaten it, he fixes it.
Wow.
Right.
And why would that be important? Because the very structure of the whole Pentateuch is Messianic. I don't have time, obviously.
But this is so good.
Right.
So if the whole structure of the whole Pentateuch is Messianic, it would be very important genealogically to know that, no, the seed is not the son of Pharaoh. The seed is not the son of all these other people. It's not from Hagar. It's specifically according to the promise of God. So the people reading Genesis for the first time, they would see this. I mean, maybe we don't see it because we have other interests in our head.
Sure.
But those are questions that would be germane to them. Like, wait a minute, I heard a story about Abraham going down to Egypt. How do we know that the child is not Pharaoh's son?
Right.
Well, you will read the narrative and say, oh, God said no. Or with the king of Gerar, how do we know? Oh, the narrative is telling us that. Because again, that would be important for their time.
Right.
Okay, now that we have the benefit of the whole Pentateuch in one book, okay, we can actually see how it plays out over time.
Right.
Whereas they would just be reading or hearing about these narratives for the first time and would be like, oh, this is answering questions that we have, not questions that a 21st century person would necessarily have.
Sure.
Wow.
I think that's also the key to understanding how to see Christ in Scripture, or at least in the Hebrew Bible, is the focal point is the Messiah, right?
Yeah.
Like that's the focal point. That's where we're tracking and we're watching how that's being fulfilled throughout as the story plays out. But as we look at Genesis, there's a word that's repeated. And for fear of being like the gentleman, Macadizek, but I think the word is Toledoth.
Sure.
And why is that significant? It keeps popping up and repeating. So can we dive in a little bit to that?
Sure. Remember I said there's three things that I want to point out. Remember, they don't have chapters and verses. So how would you know when a certain section starts and stops? Okay. So in every book, every biblical book, there's either a key phrase or there's literary cues to let you know, start here, stop here. Mm-hmm. And that's the first thing. Toledot is one of the ways where you can say, okay, this is a whole literary unit. So they were sophisticated, just not the way we would tend to think. You know, we need chapters and verses, but for them it was just a word, Toledot. Mm-hmm. So that's the first point. I was going to get to the second point. Good question. So Toledot comes from a verb which means to beget or to bring forth, okay? It can be translated in a variety of ways, either a history or an account or a bringing forth or something that comes out of, okay? So every time you would see it, you could hear all these different nuances. You know, you could hear this is a historical account. Mm-hmm. You know, it could be Moses' way of telling us this is not just a myth. Mm-hmm. This is a historical account. Mm-hmm. You could also hear it as this is what comes out of the person, whoever they're talking about. He is the progenitor. It's interesting. Yeah. In our English Bibles, we start the story of Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. Right. But if you read in the Hebrew, there is no Toledot of Abraham. It's the Toledot of his father, Terah. So what is important about Abraham? That he comes out of Terah. Right. You know, so why do we put so much emphasis on Abraham? Because Paul. Right. You know, Paul in Romans and Galatians. And of course, Abraham is important. Sure. I don't want him to, what are you saying?
So what was the point of them starting the Toledot with Terah instead of with Abraham?
Right. So remember, after the flood and then after the Tower of Babel experience, how do you know who comes from where? Right. So Terah is your link back to Shem, okay? And your link back to not Ham and not Japheth, but to Shem, and then back to Adam. Okay. So if you just started the narrative with Abraham, how would you make that historical connection that it's still in the line that God promised? Yeah. So for us, again, we don't care about that. It's like, who's Terah? Who cares? Yeah. But for them, it's how do I connect Abraham back to Shem, back to Adam? Okay? So for them, it was important. So the narrative is written in a way for you to know, oh, there's a historical connection between these gentlemen.
Which is why in the New Testament, Matthew kind of starts out with a genealogy to help you trace the Messiah.
Right.
Interesting. So I think a lot of times when we look at the New Testament, we see it as a place of grace, instruction, and faith. But we don't tend to look at the Old Testament that way. But you have kind of a different opinion on that. So tell us about it.
Sure. So the word grace, if you look it up in the Bible, you can look this up in the English version. It occurs over and over and over in terms of God's character. So when the people in the New Testament first heard the word grace, it wouldn't be like, what does that mean? You know? No, it's, this is just the historical application of God, who God is, what God has been doing, what God has revealed himself as. So if you look closely at the Genesis narrative, since we're in Genesis, it keeps telling us that these heroes of faith, if I could call them that, they found grace in the eyes of the Lord. So for them, everyone who is someone that we look up to as a faithful Hebrew or Israelite, whatever you want to call them, they're always the beneficiaries of grace. You know, you don't have this concept of Israel trying to save itself by its works. Right. That's a later anachronism, something that was taken later and then put back onto the Hebrew Bible. But if you said grace, everyone would know what it was. So then how do we relate grace to works? And I wanted to point to Genesis 26, because it says something about Abraham. So in earlier in Genesis, we know it says that Abraham believed God and God counted it to him for righteousness, right? Right. So there's the grace. He trusted God and God counted it to him for righteousness. Then later, listen to what it actually says about the exact same person, Abraham, in Genesis 26, verse 5. He says, "In your offspring, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice, kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws." Now, if you know the word order, that actually occurs in Deuteronomy 4 and Deuteronomy 5. So the relationship that you have between grace and works, I don't know if they would have called it that, is the beneficiary of grace always is faithful. You know, and that's why Paul even says, because we have grace, do we then throw away Torah? Right. No, he says, no, we establish it. Right. Why? Because beneficiaries of grace always end up being obedient. Not to try to save themselves, but because that's how saved people live. So when we think about grace, I liken it to saying, when John talks about this in John chapter 1, Moses talked about it, but in Jesus we actually see it walking on earth. So when he says Moses talked about Torah, but Jesus' grace epitomized, that's how I see it. Not that there wasn't grace there, but that Moses, all he could do is write about it.
Right.
But how do we know that it looks like? John tells us when you see Jesus, you see it manifested in a human being.
I love that. I love just kind of the clearer, more robust picture of the Old Testament and the way that there's not such this divide between old and new.
Right.
It's just this continuation of like grace, instruction, and faith continued, but we have more revelation on it.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I just want you to expound just a little bit more, because I love this concept of the seed and the threats to the promise and then God's salvation, because, you know, we ended with like Abraham, but then there's this whole, you know, they go into Egypt, God talks about that. How does that, and I know we're getting past a little bit of Genesis, but like when you look at the Pentateuch and the arc of the Pentateuch, how is God still, is he still working within that framework of like seed, threats to the promise, and how does that look like?
Sure. The narrative in Genesis ends by giving a messianic promise, okay? So we know in Genesis 49, when Jacob is talking to Joseph, he's telling him, this is how things are, or actually he's talking to all his sons, this is how things are going to turn out, okay? So he says, I'm going to explain something to you. Then he talks about Judah in terms of kingship. So that was like something... Wait, what do you mean?
Right.
Because Joseph had that dream that people were going to bow to him, but then we see it actually given and promised through his son, Judah, okay? Or excuse me, through his brother, Judah. If you keep reading the rest of the Pentateuch in Numbers 24 and Deuteronomy 32 through 34, those promises are expanded. Where you have the promise of a seed, you have the territory that seed is going to rule over, and then you have what that rulership is going to look like. It's interesting that the last promise given about the Messiah in the book of Deuteronomy talks about God atoning for his people, okay? So the work of the Messiah that's explained in Isaiah 53 is really just an expansion of a concept that was given a lot earlier. So again, these things are new to us because maybe we're not reading the way we should. No, I'm just joking. But for them, they would hear these connections probably first because of linguistics. They understand, you know, literary connections. This word is used earlier. Whereas in the English version, you can still see it, but when you hear it, it's a lot easier to pick up on those nuances. So that whole concept of seed is why genealogies are so important. Remember I told you I used to read 8 to 10 hours a day.
Yeah.
Wow. Did you sleep?
I think I was sleeping part of it when I was reading through the book of Numbers, because I was like, who cares? Why is genealogies important to my life? But again, if you're writing to a people and you want them to understand the historical trajectory of God's promise, they don't have smartphones, they don't have televisions. What do? You have to make it crystal clear and beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Messiah is coming from the line that God promised, which is why when you get to the book of Ezra, there are some people, they're like, well, we don't know your genealogy. Sorry, you can't be a part.
Right.
Like for us, it's like the inhumanity. But again, it's how do we know where the Messiah comes from? Yeah. And that's why where the Hebrew Bible ends talking about genealogies, as you mentioned, the New Testament picks up Matthew 1, Luke 3, talking about the Messiah can be traced back. We have the genealogical records, so we know there's a historical connection between the showing of the Messiah and God's initial promise. So that's why for us, again, it may not be sexy, it may not be cutting edge and relevant for your everyday life, but if you're reading the Bible to understand the promise and the plan of God, you'll say, wow, look how careful God was to make sure that his seed came the way that he promised.
Wow. Despite ourselves.
Yeah.
So you alluded to this a little bit already. So just to give some clarity. So by the end of Genesis, the promise of the Messiah, we basically see Jacob, Israel, right, giving this prophetic message to his children. Mm-hmm. And then we go to Exodus and they're in captivity. So the threat then is the slavery, right?
Right. The threat would be annihilation.
Right.
Because remember, all the boys were killed.
Right.
And what does Matthew pick up on in his gospel?
Oh,
all the boys being killed.
Yeah.
And he actually uses that typologically to say, hey, remember when Satan tried to do it again? He's trying to do it now. So again, I think everyone in Jesus' time reading this narrative would automatically make that connection. So we see Pharaoh trying to snuff out the promised line, okay, if you will. What does God do? He raises up Moses. And then you have this amazing story of this child who is saved, who then comes and restores his people and then gets them back on track in terms of their historical mission to be the progenitors of the Messiah. But that concept is all the way through the Hebrew Bible. In fact, why does God tell Rehoboam, Solomon's son, that he's going to keep one line alive? He could have just wiped them out or given them all to Jeroboam.
Right.
He says, but for David and for the sake of the promise that he made to him.
Right.
So again, God, despite human flaws and failures, God says, I'm going to bring my plan to fruition, even if it means I have to deal with people like me,
Right.
So
I really love the conciseness of that type of framework, that people can have that and look through the Bible and not think every chapter they're changing the channel and it's something new and how do I follow, to be like, this is my anchor that I'm going to hold through the whole narrative. What's something you'd like to leave our audience with today as they're reading through the Old Testament or they're reading through the Bible? What is something that you would share with them? That
you know the end of the story. I think for those who were initially reading these books, there was a sense, okay, how do all these parts, it looks like moving parts, how do we see it together? But for us, we have the benefit of the whole canon, if you will. So we can say, okay, so we know Jesus comes from this place, in this situation to do this work. So now when I'm reading the Hebrew Bible, I'm saying, how do the parts fit into that story? Okay, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You know what's going to happen. Now the journey becomes, God, how do I understand how you are working in history to bring about your intended result? So along the journey, he's going to teach you about faith. He's going to teach you about hope. He's going to teach you about love. He's going to teach you about disobedience and how disobedience actually frustrates the plan. If you notice, with the kings of Israel especially, like that whole book, it's actually one book. We just call it 1st and 2nd Kings. That whole book is how God keeps it together despite these wicked people, So that teaches me to be humble. Because I'm not up here thinking that I have arrived. I know there's many things that God does in my life in spite of. So like I said, the big picture is we're pointing towards the Messiah, but along the way, God is going to show us some things about ourselves. And if we're good listeners, I think while falling in love with the hope of the Messiah, that we're also learning how gracious God is to people like us.
We're so glad you joined us this week as we finish our discussion with Dr. Jerome Skinner on understanding Genesis messianically. Recommended reading for this week, if you want to learn more about this topic, is a dense but very insightful book called International Bible Commentary on Genesis by Dr. Dukan. We want to thank the Adventist Learning Community for making this program possible, as well as our guest, Dr. Jerome Skinner. If you're not already following us on Facebook, YouTube, or Instagram, be sure to do so at the handle @AdventNext. Thanks so much for tuning in, and see you next week.